Welcome to Module 6. In this module, we're going to complete our two-part lesson on studying and testing, basically study skills. And in this module, we're going to focus on testing. So in Module 5, hopefully I gave you some good ideas for ways of studying, taking notes, thinking about your study practices. But unfortunately, in college, the way we assess whether you've learned or something is testing. And in fact, if you're a pre-health student, if you want to go to dental school or medical school, you even have to take standardized tests like the MCAT and the DAT. So testing is going to be a part of your life. And so it's important. There are strategies that you can do and science behind how people test and things that you can think about and learn that will make you a better test taker. All right, now the caveat here is that you have to study for the test typically in order to do well for the test. But even that sometimes isn't enough for some students. Some students don't test well. They say, I'm a bad test taker. Well, that doesn't mean you can't take a test. It just means that you need to think about strategies that are going to make you better at taking them. So hopefully in this module, I'll give you some of those strategies. All right, so I want to review briefly about the past 3 modules on what we're focusing on. So in module number 4, we focused on how people learn. And the key to that was how do you know something? So how do you know metacognition essentially? Making sure that you can assess whether you know something before you actually take the test is one of the biggest keys to being successful on the test. If you've ever taken a test where you knew you weren't prepared for it, versus when you do know you're prepared, you understand how much that confidence boost can give you on the test. In the last module, we talked about the preview, review, attend, study, and assess, the study cycle. And I want to focus on this last part of the study cycle, which is assess. The key here is that you need to test yourself before the professor tests you. If you preview, review, attend, and study, you'll do pretty well in class, but if you test yourself beforehand, if you assess through very unique and active ways of assessing the material, right, that just gives you that extra bump and that extra improvement in the exams. And I'm going to give you some ideas on how you can do that and how professors test as well. So there's our study cycle and there's our metacognition. So the goal here is I want you to think about whether you really know something before you take the test. All right, and that's the question you should always be asking yourself. And if you're not sure, that means you probably haven't studied as much as you could have. Okay, so how do you assess yourself? So typically in class, I'll ask you to give me the top 5 ways that you study for a test. And many times I hear these same 4 answers over and over again. Many of you make flashcards, and flashcards are a great way of assessing your knowledge. All right. One caveat with flashcards I want to tell you is that the process of making them doesn't count as studying. You need to make them, and then you need to use them to actually study. So if you spend 3 hours making flashcards, it doesn't count as 3 hours of studying. You got to then study probably another few hours for those flashcards. But they are very good, and there are nice software programs that you can use for flashcards as well. And these are kind of the gold standard. Many of you prefer one-on-one study buddies, so someone that you can kind of ask questions to and quiz back and forth. Many of you will say that you'll just reread your notes. You'll read notes over and over again from class. Maybe you'll read, maybe you'll read the PowerPoint over again, and so on. So I hear that. And then some of you might rewrite your notes. So if you go back to the learning styles we were talking about, if you are a reading and writing learning style, rewriting your notes can really help you retain the information. So I'm going to talk about a couple of these methods and give you some pointers about the proper way of doing some of these ways of studying and some data showing you that there are some ways you do this that is not effective. So the goal of all studying is actually, you don't know this because you wouldn't think of it this way, but the goal of all studying is to take all the facts that you're learning in your short-term memory and through some kind of process of rehearsal, to convert them into long-term memory so that you can learn them and use them at your leisure. So if I ask you a question, 3 months from now, you still remember that information. Okay, so that's why we study, all right, and that's why we learn, hopefully. This is actually called the general memory model. Many psychologists have studied this because they're trying to understand how does this work in the brain? How does the brain convert things from short-term to long-term? And remember, if you have a model, you have to test that model. And the way we test things in science is by creating hypotheses. And so one of the hypotheses that was testing the general memory model was called the total time assumption hypothesis. And this is the hypothesis that says the longer the information is held in my short-term memory, the more likely it will be stored in long-term. Right? And we actually undergo this when studying for a test. We try and just memorize facts in our short-term memory, repeating them to ourselves over and over again, hoping that we'll remember them long-term. And this is the idea behind data dump. When you first get your test and you have to remember a formula or something and you don't want to forget it, you'll immediately write it on the top of your test. Right? That's trying to keep something in short-term to be converted from long-term. So many scientists have actually tested this total time assumption hypothesis. So I'm going to show you a couple pieces of data. This one's from Callender and McDaniel from 2004. And they took 16 students and put them in a group. And they gave them a social psychology chapter from some kind of textbook. And they allowed one group to read it one time and the other group to read it twice. And then they gave students 22 multiple choice tests and 4 application questions. So the multiple choice tests are probably answering like fact-based questions. And then the 4 application questions are going to answer whether they really understood the concepts or the material. All right, and here's the results. The group that read the chapter once got an 84% on the multiple choice and a 79% on the application. The group that was allowed to read it an extra time got an 83% multiple choice and an 80% on the application. So the conclusion of the study is that if the total time hypothesis was true, the more times you read something, the more time you had it in your short-term memory, the better your long-term memory might be. And in fact, we don't see that at all. If you read things one time and then if you reread it another time, it doesn't help you remember it any more than the first time you read it. All right, so many of you might be like, well, that's only reading it twice, but I read my notes a lot more than just twice. All right, so an older study from the 80s also did this, and they allowed a group to read it 10 times. And this was like a passage of an article or something like that. And you can see here the scores on free recall. This was kind of like a short answer question. Cued recall was like a multiple choice type question. In the group that read it once scored an 80% in the free recall and a 48% in the cued recall. And the group was allowed to read something 10 times. And they basically barely scored an improvement. The free recall was a 6% improvement, cued recall 2% improvement. So even reading something 10 times didn't give a significant increase in the performance. So the bottom line, and there's lots of studies that show this over and over again, the total time hypothesis is false. It's not how long you keep something in your short-term memory. You have to actually do something with it. So rereading is a very passive behavior. You're not actually using the material in your brain. You're just rereading over and over again. And so if your favorite way of studying is to just reread your notes, unless the professor asks identically what's in your notes, you might not recognize the question. So many times when students take a test and they're like, I have no idea where that question came from. I don't even recognize the words in that question. That's because they were probably more familiar with their notes and less familiar with the material overall. And so basically, rereading text or rereading lecture notes is a very passive way of studying, right? And they maintain information, but it doesn't actually promote learning and retention. And unfortunately, it only retains the information of that specific format. So let's say your lecture notes are of using certain words, but yet the exam questions use different words. You might be lost from that disconnect, and in reality, the words aren't even important. They might be asking a certain concept that you might have missed by just rereading. So rereading is okay, but be aware that if you do like to reread, you need to do something with those notes, and I'll show you some ideas of what you can do. All right, so here's a video, and this is one of the best ways of doing that assessment part of the study cycle. So how do you remember things, and how do you test yourself before the test comes? So I want to show you this video, and then I'll talk about it.
Hi, I'm David Myers, psychology author and Hope College psychology professor. I'm here to help you learn how to make things memorable so that you can learn and remember more from your classes and perhaps get better grades as well. You might want to pull out something to write or type on, because the first thing you need to learn about learning is that the more actively you process and rehearse information, the better you will retain it. Let me ask you, were you ever told that the best way to prepare for a test is to reread the chapter over and again? that the purpose of tests is simply to assess what you've learned, that you should study but one topic at a time in the same place for lengthy periods? If so, and if you believe these things, do you find yourself struggling to remember all those new concepts in your courses? Well, don't despair. There are more effective ways to learn. Here are some strategies that, if put to work in your own studies, will help you better retain what you're learning. The big idea, which has now been confirmed in lots of experiments by memory researchers like Henry Roediger and Mark McDaniel, is this. To cement new learning in your mind, what helps more than rereading is repeated self-testing and rehearsal of what you've learned. The memory researchers call this the testing effect. We also sometimes call it the retrieval practice effect or test-enhanced learning. So, for example, in one experiment, Jeffrey Karpicki and Henry Roediger had students learn 40 Swahili words. Some of them kept restudying the words. Others retained those words much better if, instead, they spent the time repeatedly testing themselves on the words. And so the principle here is that testing is not just a way to assess learning, it's also a way to improve learning. We learn and remember material best when we put it in our own words, when we rehearse it, and then retrieve it. And that's the testing effect. And it's a phenomenon that I built into my text through the SQ3R study method. SQ3R refers to its 5 steps. S for survey, Q for question, and then the 3 R's. Read, retrieve, review. So, to study a chapter, first, survey. Take a bird's eye view. Scan the headings. Notice the chapter organization. Next, question. Before you read each main section, try to answer the learning objective question I posed at the beginning. You probably won't be able to answer, but that's fine. Trying and failing to retrieve the answer is actually quite helpful to learning. Those who test their understanding before they read and discover what they don't know often learn better. Next, read. Actively search for the question's answer. Read actively and critically. Ask questions. Take notes. Make the ideas your own. Ask how they relate to your life. Then, having read, retrieve the main ideas. Periodically pause in your reading and rehearse what you've just read. Ask yourself. Yes, test yourself repeatedly. To help you do this, in my books, I offer periodic retrieval practice opportunities throughout each chapter. With each one of these, you can rehearse what you've learned, and you can check your answers and reread as needed. If you struggle a bit, that's fine. A certain level of difficulty or challenge is desirable. It's better than questions that are too easy for you or impossibly hard. And then finally, the last R, review. Read over the chapter organization and your notes. Also, one other thing, it really helps if you distribute your study time. Don't cram. If you want to remember for 5 minutes, well, you can just repeat something over and over. But if you want to remember for 5 months or 5 years, then study and test yourself off and on every week or so. Space out your study time. Do it in different places. Okay, let's put the testing effect to work. You might want to pause and ask yourself, what is the testing effect? And how does it work? The testing effect is the fact that recalling the answer, what we call retrieval practice, boosts memory. For example, at test time. And let me ask you another question. What are the steps of SQ3R? Do you remember? The SQ3R steps are survey, question, read, retrieve, review. So, in summary, test, test, test. Take advantage of self-testing and self-checking opportunities. Second, be active in your learning. Put things in your own words. Connect new ideas with important things in your life. Third, distribute your study time. Space study leads to much better retention than does cramming. Now, I know, some people learn and remember more easily than others, just as some people naturally are faster or stronger. But for all of us, muscles grow stronger with exercise, and so do our mental muscles. Thus, the good news is that test-enhanced learning is one way in which you can strengthen your memory muscles. Now, just ask yourself one last time, what is the testing effect?
All right, so that's called the testing effect, and it's a highly recommended way of studying, and it takes some work, though. You have to be creative, and you have to find some things. So what I want you to do, this is very similar to Module 5, is I want you to go to the content section and download the homework assignment. And the homework assignment is going to have a series of activities and then an end homework assignment. So again, you can do these right now. I prefer you to do them while we do the lecture. That way it'd be fresh in your mind. But of course, if you want to do this at the end, that's fine as well. So pause the video and do that. And then activity number 1 is I just want you to specify what's one way you could implement the testing effect during your study sessions. Now, if you already do the testing effect, go ahead and state how you do it. What do you do? All right, what are some things that you do that is the testing effect that work for you? And if you don't, what are something that you could do, that you could add to your study sessions? All right, so the testing effect is a really good way. And so again, here are some strategies that are practiced by students on when they study. And on the on the left-hand column are the strategies. So you see things like highlighting, rereading, rewriting. On the right-hand side is the percentage of students who listed that strategy as the number 1 strategy they use. And in the middle is actually based on research, how effective they are to learn. Right? And what you see is that 55% of students claim that the number 1 strategy is rereading. And as we showed you about from those studies already, that's one of the lowest ways of remembering something. Some of the highest ways, but low ranking, was recall practice, so self-testing. All right, that's an extremely highly effective way of studying, the testing effect, and yet so few students do it. All right, things like self-explanation. So use the Cornell notes. Are you able to summarize stuff in your own words, or are you able to explain it to someone else? Those are medium level. They're pretty high. Medium level effects, and they didn't have any data on that. Some students do use those, of course. Summarizing, so writing in your own words or saying things in your own words. 4% of students don't do that. Some people love to highlight, and in fact, that's one of the lowest ways of learning, because when you highlight a phrase, nothing's happening in your brain. Now, the caveat here is if you highlight something and then later take that highlighted phrase and then reword it, summarize it, or self-explain it, or even recall practice yourself, self-test, then you're converting highlighting to a high-impact practice. But if you're just highlighting, just so that you can reread, all right, you're basically doing some of the lowest effective things when you study. So be aware of that. These are not the best strategies. You need to do something active. And unfortunately, these are easy, and the active things require work. All right, so be aware that it does require a little bit more work because it is active. But again, if you do that work in your intense study sessions, your studying can be more efficient. All right, which means that you actually can spend less time on it because they're more effective. All right, so the bottom line that I want to try to get across to you is that restudying or rereading something is passive, and it creates what's called an illusion of knowing. So you might think you're really prepared for the test because your notes are very familiar to you, but in reality, your brain only has a surface level understanding of that material. And until you start testing yourself, you don't really know if you know it or not. And so what will happen is during the exam that you're taking for the class, it's testing you on the material, and then if you don't do well in the exam, that's telling you you didn't know it. But what I want you to find a way to do is to figure that out beforehand, before you take the test, and that way you can study more and fix it before you actually take that exam. So that brings me to this next concept, when I want to introduce you to a system that many people use when making exam questions and when thinking about assessment. So how do I assess whether you know something? And this is called Bloom's Taxonomy. And what this is this is a hierarchical arrangement of levels of learning, or levels of understanding something. And so each level actually has verbs associated with that level. So when you take an exam, you can figure out where on that exam question, what level they're trying to assess, someone's trying to assess at you, and you can study at that level as well by creating your own exam questions or assessment ways of figuring that out. So here's an example. Remembering is the lowest level. So remembering is the easiest thing for learning. If I just say, remember these 10 facts, don't worry about what they mean, you don't need to understand them, just remember their names. Okay, that's a very low level of understanding. And when you take an exam, typically you'll hear things like, please define this, or state this, or recall this number, list that, etc. Very low level. So it's very easy to remember. The next level above that is understanding. So not only do you have to remember the facts, but you have to understand what they mean. So on an exam question, you'll see things like describe, or discuss, or explain, or identify, or locate. These are assuming that you know what the terms are, what they mean, and you understand how they're related to each other. The next step above that is applying, where you have to take what you know and understand and apply it to maybe a different example or a different context. These three levels are what we call low Bloom's taxonomy. And in fact, most of your courses actually are going to be at these levels. All right. When you're a senior, you're going to start taking courses that are going to push you to the high Bloom's level of things like analyzing. So you're going to get like a figure from a paper, and then you have to analyze what that figure is saying. Evaluating. So you're going to give maybe two different arguments, and you have to figure out which argument is correct based on the information you know. Or creating. So you have to create your own experiment or create your own design of something like that. These are very high levels and require you to understand the information a lot better than these low levels. And the reason I introduced this to you in BioSkills is because, one, when you're taking a test, it's important to know what level that class is going to assess you. If you're taking Bio 1 and 2, we typically assess students at remembering and understanding. All we're going to want you to do is know some of the facts, be able to explain something. Don't worry about creating examples or figuring that out. All you gotta do is just know those facts. So for example, if you just have to know something, a lot of times flashcards are the way to do it. So that can kind of govern your assessment strategy. If you have to be able to apply or explain how things work or give context to things, flashcards aren't the best because that's very difficult to do. In fact, when you have to apply something or understand it at a high level, your best bet is to write something out as an explanation, summarize concepts in your own words, explain them to someone else. So many times your study strategy is going to change based on how you're being assessed for those exams. All right. So that brings me to activity number 2 on your homework, and this is kind of, you can do this in 2 ways. So for example, what I would like, if you have possible any exam that you have from either an old class or a class you're taking now, I would like you to try and find it, get it available, and bring it out. And if you don't have one, I'll tell you some alternatives you can do if you don't have an exam ready to use. But if you have an exam, what you want to do is go through the exam and try to identify, write out the question that you think was a low Bloom's level question. So what question was really kind of straightforward and easy? So what was like a basic fact that they just asked you to know? And then go through your exam and try to identify a high Bloom's level. You may not be able to because your exam might be from a low level class, but try and figure out what exam question was extremely difficult or much more complex than just remember this question or remember this fact or so on. Okay, so if you have an exam, go grab the exam, and it can be from anything, it can be from math, it can be from physics or whatever, and do the activity using an exam that you already have. If you don't have an exam, what I want you to do is do the opposite. Do what's called You're the Professor, where think of any subject you've learned. Think of like cellular respiration or parts of the cell or something like that, and create one low-level question and create one high-level question. All right, so parts of the cell, what is the function of the nucleus? Okay, that's a very low-level question. Okay, so just explain or tell me what the function is. High-level question is, if a cell is missing mitochondria, what would be the effect, or something like that. So you have to kind of analyze a situation. So for this activity, if you have an exam, go ahead and pick a question from your exams. If you don't have an exam, just create your own questions. And don't spend like a whole day on this. Just try and think of something easy to create. And the reason I have you do this is when you're studying, one of the best things you can do is actually make your own exams. You can try to think, okay, here's a concept, here's cellular respiration, or I'm focusing on ATP. What exam questions would I make in this class? And a lot of times what you'll be surprised by is that's how you're testing yourself. That's how you're doing the testing effect. And if you're stuck, if maybe you can't create your own exam questions, use Google. And in fact, what you'll find is that you'll find lots of exams on Google. So let me show you an example. Okay, here I'm at Google, and let's say I'm studying physiology, and I'm studying the kidney, all right? So what you can do is type in physiology kidney exam questions, and see it'll auto-populate exam questions, and you hit return. And what you'll find are actually lots of exam questions from different schools. Now, here's the hard part. You have to try and find an exam that's at your level. So sometimes by typing in 3,000 level courses, the word 3,000, you might actually be able to limit those to courses that only have 3,000 level. Sometimes not. So here's a Bio 417 quiz, right? And this just has some, make that bigger, this just has some exam questions for renal physiology. They don't have to be exactly what you're learning. They don't have to be, sometimes they might be harder, sometimes they might be easier, but as you're trying to do these other exam questions, all right, you're testing yourself. And by looking at other people's exams, it actually makes you better for your own exam. all right, because you're going to look at these from a diversity of perspectives. Okay, so if you can't think of your own exam questions, you can always Google and try and find exams, because there's lots of exams online. All right, so after you've done activity 2, then please move on in the video. The last activity I want you to do is to think about the test day. So let's say you did the study cycle all correct and you spent a lot of time studying and you did the testing effect and you've tested yourself and you know you're ready for this exam, and then you come on test day and then you still don't do well. All right, there's lots of factors that come into doing well on tests. So what I want you to do is think about, on activity 3, think about a day or a time on an exam you took in which you didn't do as well as you would have liked. All right. What factors do you think contributed to that test performance? Was it things like I didn't study enough, I was too nervous, I didn't get enough sleep, didn't have caffeine? You know, think of anything that you think could have contributed to test performance. All right. So there's lots of things you can actually do to help limit the distractions or anxieties or stresses of those test days. So obviously before the test there's lots of things you can do, and the first of course is studying. So first of all, if you didn't study, you're not going to do well on that test, and you're probably going to feel very nervous as well because you know you're not prepared. So that's the first effect. So that's the first thing. If you didn't study, then understand that's what you need to do. So review, assess, do the testing effect, those type of things. Don't cram. So many of you might actually spend the 30 minutes before the test begins by actually studying more, trying to cram as much as you can. Well, what can happen is you're so stressed out that you're actually confusing facts. You don't give your brain a time to rest. And then immediately the test gets handed out and your brain is already stressed out. If you take 30 minutes before the test, possibly, and just relax and do something else, watch a video or just chat with a friend, that gives your brain a chance to calm down, relax, and it helps you analyze the information a lot better. All right. Sleep is important, and I know many of you, when you're studying for tests, don't get enough sleep. So obviously, try and get as much sleep as you can. But even a few hours of sleep before test is very important. Sleep before the test is very important. In fact, many studies have shown that a lot of the neural connections that are being made while you're in REM sleep. And many times you might have dreamed of stuff you were studying, and that's actually your brain working with that material. So sleep is important. So if you're going to cram, at least schedule some sleep in there so that way you have a rested brain. And then relaxation is very key before the test. So pray, meditate, whatever you can do to relax your brain. Get some coffee if you're a coffee drinker. Now, if you're not a coffee drinker, I don't recommend doing it because you'd be all hopped on caffeine. But get some coffee. Laugh, and what I mean by that is talk to someone who's really not going to stress you out about the test. Talk to a family member or watch a funny video. All of these strategies help you to relax, and many studies have shown that the more relaxed you are, the better you do in a test. The more stressed you are, even if you think you know the material, the more stressed you are, the worse you do on an exam. All right, during the test, there's some things you can do as well. So one of them is kind of silly, but I say it all the time: dress for success. So if you dress nicely, if you feel confident, that can translate into confidence on the test. Now, obviously, if you didn't study, dressing well is not going to help you. But if you're showing up in pajamas, you might not feel that great because you just pulled an all-nighter, or maybe you were cramming, and you also just don't feel good. So it can also limit your performance. Come prepared. So know what's expected of your test. If your test requires a calculator or a pencil or a ruler or whatever the tests are going to require, make sure you bring those things, because let's say you show up for the exam that day and then all of a sudden you forgot a calculator and you forgot your pencil, and that just adds to the stress of the test. All right, so make sure you're coming prepared. When the test gets handed out, don't just start on number 1. Many of us do that just because it's number 1. But look over the whole test. What's the test like? Is it just straight multiple choice? Are there some mixtures of short answer tests with multiple choice? Many times I recommend, if there's a short answer portion or an essay portion, to actually do that part first and then go back to the multiple choice, because a lot of times writing out your thoughts helps your brain be able to analyze complex information better, and then you go to the multiple choice question and you already understand the information better, your brain is fresh with it, and you can do better on those. It really depends on what you're weak in. If your multiple choice questions, you don't do as well in multiple choice than you do in essays, then I would do the essays first. Do your best section first, and then go back to the section that you need the most time on. Many of you will say that you miss exam questions, or you don't do well in tests because you didn't read the question carefully. So the question tricked you up or something like that. So make sure that you're reading the test carefully. You got to relax, calm down, and not be in a stressful situation. And definitely mark up the test. So highlight key Bloom's words in the exam. What is the question asking? So if the question says, explain this, then that means you have to actually give an explanation. If the question just says state or define, that means you just have to list something, or that's the remembering level. All right, so be clear on what the question is asking. So what Bloom's verbs are there? And that'll help you recognize some of those exam questions. Many times on multiple choice questions, the multiple choices are very similar to each other. So if you're not sure of the correct answer right off the bat, your best bet is to work backwards. So try to increase your odds. If you can just limit one choice that's not true, you now have a 33% chance. All right? And if you can get rid of two, you have a 50-50 chance. So definitely always work backwards to try and increase your odds. And a lot of times that process, when you're explaining to yourself why an answer is not right, that'll help jar in your memory some of the other things of why the other ones are correct. So it can really help you analyze. If you're stuck on a multiple choice question, don't just sit there and try to think of the answer. Try to start working backwards, and it might help you come to the right answer. And then ultimately, sometimes you know the answer, and yet the multiple choices threw you off, and then it caused you to be confused, and then you got it wrong. So you'll get the question back and go, oh, I knew that answer. Why did I get it wrong? Well, that's because the multiple choices were actually confusing you. So I recommend this for a lot of students is to take a piece of paper or your hand and actually cover up the choices. Read the question out. What is the question asking? And try to actually write your own answer in your own words next to the question. And then go to the multiple choices and find the one that best fits your answer. Now, only some types of questions this will work for, but it's a really good way to avoid getting confused on multiple choices. So there's a lot of strategies for taking multiple choice exams. It's not just, I don't see the answer off the top of my head and I'm confused now. If that's the case, you have to stop and think and start working backwards and really looking through those choices. All right, so before the test, you have to obviously study and try to relax and try to calm down and get ready for the test and do whatever strategy works best for you. During the test, you got to really work with that test. I prefer to see tests come back to me all marked up, notes written everywhere, things highlighted and circled, and that tells me that that person was really working with the test questions. But at the end of the day, after the test, there's something you can do as well. So you're going to get your test back, and many times you'll look at the exam question and you'll go, oh, I don't know why I got that wrong. That was a stupid mistake. But it's really important to not leave it right there. You need to stop and then look at what was the mistake. What happened on that one question that caused me to get it wrong? Many times I hear students say, oh, I always make that mistake. Well, if that's always the case, you're not learning from it. How can you learn from your mistakes? So one, go see your professor. If you're not sure why you're missing that question or what happened on that one content, or you don't even know where that was on the note, so you're just confused in general, go to their office hours and bring your test and come with honest questions. Say, okay, question number 2, I didn't understand where this came from. Can you point me in the right direction? Right? And your professor should be able to help you figure out where you're missing some of that information. Right? We really want to see our students do well, and we want to help you learn from your mistakes, because the faster you learn from your mistakes, the better you do in the long run. Lastly, you can do what's called an exam autopsy, and I recommend this for every single exam you ever take. And in fact, it's going to be part of your homework. And I'm going to show you what the exam autopsy is. It's a handout that's actually posted on the content section under Module 6. And again, this is a either or. If you have an exam that you've already gotten back from a class, a prior exam or whatever, I want you to use the exam autopsy handout and pick 4 questions from that exam that you got wrong, or if you didn't get 4 wrong, just any that you got wrong, and try to identify the possible reasons you missed that question. And I'll show you what I mean in a second. If you don't have an exam, I want you to just think in general. What are the top 3 or 4 reasons you miss a question? And you can use the exam autopsy. So you can kind of think of theoretical questions. So typically on your exams you get back, why do you typically miss a question? So let's go over it. I'm going to pull up the exam autopsy and show you what I mean. All right, here's the exam autopsy, and you can see on the left-hand side is the test items missed, and these are blanks. So for every question you miss, just write the number, the exam number, and if you want, you can write kind of the first few words of the question. I don't really need to see what the question is specifically. And then over here, you have lots of examples of reasons why students miss exams. And typically, my guess is you can find that you'll fall into one of these. And they're broken down into five main categories: insufficient information, test anxiety, careless mistakes, lack of test wisdom, and other. And then you can see they're broken down even further. So insufficient information. I did not read the textbook thoroughly. That might be a reason why. So maybe the question was about something that was in the textbook. The information was not in my notes. I studied the information but could not remember it, and so on. Test anxiety things like I experienced a mental block. So many times that will happen. You know the answer, you just can't think of it. Or you panic during the test. Careless mistakes. There's actually many types of careless mistakes. Which one did you do? Did you miss the directions? Did you change the correct answer to a wrong one? I did not notice a double negative statement, so exam questions that say things like which of the following is not this. Lack of test wisdom are examples of that are I did not choose the best answer choice. I did not eliminate obvious incorrect choices. So things like these are test strategy ideas. And then they gave you some space for some other. There may be some other reasons that you can think of that are not on this list, but this is a pretty exhaustive list. And so what you want to do is find 4 questions that you got wrong for your homework, or like I said, if you don't have an exam, 4 theoretical questions. What happens typically on your exams when you take them? And you can just write 1, 2, 3, 4, or exam, or whatever the question number on your exam that you're using. And then you're just going to put a check under any box that applies. So it's possible more than one of these might apply to the same exact question, right? And I know this can be kind of redundant and confusing, so try and do your best to pick the best example of why you got that wrong. And the reason I have you do exam autopsies and show you this exercise because you should do this after every single exam. In fact, I posted this on e-learning, so you can print out this and make tons of copies for as much as you want. Because, for example, if you knew the main ideas but you needed the details, so on this insufficient information, right, what does that mean? You can go to your professor and say, when I did my exam autopsy, I realized that I knew what you were talking about, but I didn't understand this detail part of it. Where did I miss the detail? And your professor can really help you find out where that detail is, because it's probably in the PowerPoint somewhere, probably in the notes somewhere, and it's possible you just missed it. And being able to figure that out and learn from that is one of the biggest improvements that any student can make. And our goal is by the time you graduate that you'll have gained these skills so that this is no longer an issue, so that you can learn from every mistake that you ever make on any kind of exam, or actually anything in general, you can learn from. And that's the biggest thing that you can do to improve always. So again, your homework is the 3 activities that you did already from this PowerPoint, and then you're going to do the exam autopsy. You're going to pick 4 questions. And as I wrote on the homework assignment, you can either print out that exam autopsy and scan it in and put it in the Dropbox, or if you don't have a scanner, just go ahead and use the Word document and type out your answers. So type out the question and then type out the reasons why you got it wrong from the exam autopsy option, and then that way you don't have to scan it in. All right, and then remember this homework is due along with the module quiz, so go ahead and take the quiz number 6 after this as well. And as always, if you have any technical issues with these handouts or the Dropbox or quizzes, please just email me and let me know. Okay, so I will see you in the next module.